Today, I'm speaking with Sarah Eustis-Guthrie, one of the co-founders of Maternal Health Initiative, a nonprofit incubated through charity entrepreneurship.
What's it like to found a charity?
What happens next? How do you go from deciding to found a charity in Ghana to actually implementing a working program?
Well, that's exactly the question I was asking myself 2 years ago. It was pretty daunting to be in this space of, hey, I now got a bunch of money and I now, get to start this organization, also have to start this organization. I think one thing I loved about my co-founder, Ben, is he's just one of the most entrepreneurial people I've ever met.
Wow.
And so when he was faced with that question, he was like, cool, we'll figure it out. All we have to do is just kind of ask people who've done it before, kind of think on a big picture way. Yeah, what do you have to do? And we'll just go from there. And meanwhile, I'm sitting there being like, how did I get into this situation? This is terrifying.
Yeah.
But we figured it out. And I do think he was genuinely right that a lot of it is kind of more simple than you might think it is. So if you just sit down and think, well, how would you start a health organization? Well, you think, well, I'm going to have to get permissions from the government. I'm going to have to figure out where I want to work. There's a lot of really concrete questions there. And so what we did is we reached out to a bunch of potential partners. These are local nonprofits that had implemented similar programs in the past. And once we had these partners, what we were tasked with is figuring out exactly what the program should actually look like. Because going from we want to run postpartum family planning to building an actual program has a lot of questions there.
Yeah.
And so when you look at the studies also, you'll find that postpartum family planning can look like infinitely different iterations. And one thing that we realized is that because we wanted to devise our programming based on the evidence base, based on the studies. And what we found is that studies tend to be very good at telling you the numbers about how the program did or did not work out, but they often don't have a lot of details in terms of what was actually in the program. So we found that we were lucky if it would say things like, the providers were trained for 1 day versus 1 month, and then extremely lucky if they would say anything about what the providers were even trained in. And so this process involved a lot of desk research. It involved a lot of talking to experts. So we would email someone and say, hey, we're implementing this program. Can you talk to us and tell us what exactly it was that you did? And I found myself feeling quite insecure throughout this process. I had this perennial fear that I would email people and they would say, who are you to found this program? You don't know what you're talking about.
Totally. Yeah, I would feel the same way.
Yeah, it got a bit better as time went on. I do think this was something that we struggled with and maybe was a bit of a mistake that we kind of perennially felt so insecure that it made us afraid to ask silly questions.
Yellow flags and difficult calls.
So one interesting kind of funny thing that happened is we ended up going on a trip to Ghana even before we decided on it as a country, because there was another family planning charity that was going on a trip. This was actually only a couple weeks after the charity entrepreneurship program had ended, but they said, hey, we're going to Ghana. We know you're considering it. Do you want to just kind of tag along? And so we thought, hey, let's tag along. So we went on this trip. We went to some hospitals. We spoke to some experts. And we both got kind of a bad gut feeling from the trip, if that makes any sense. It's a bit hard to pin down, but I think some of it is we were struck by how high the baseline level of family planning access was. And to be clear, we were mostly in the capital, Accra, so that's going to be very different from other regions of the country. But you're just walking around, you see a billboard for family planning, or I did this thing where I went into a bunch of different pharmacies and I asked if I could get family planning, which was a slightly awkward experience, but really interesting. So that was in September. And then as we worked on the geographic analysis, we realized, hey, there's actually really strong fundamental reasons to do it. And also, as people who are evidence-based, we don't want to over-update on gut feelings. And honestly, even now, I don't really know what to do with this. I think we actually made a pretty reasonable call in still going with it, because one thing we found later, and you can see has a kind of obvious truth is that there's so much variation within countries. So later on, when we'd go to more rural regions, it's like you're in a totally different country in terms of the access. And our program was predicated on, we were mainly working on in the northern parts of the country where the situation is totally different. But still, in retrospect, it does make me feel a little silly to say, hey, we had this bad gut feeling. And then in some senses, that bad gut feeling panned out. And in fact, and I'm almost a little like embarrassed to say this, but what ended up happening is that we had so many doubts, the ones I mentioned, but also a number of other ones, that we sat down in that fall and we said, is this still a good idea? Like, should we still do this project? And I think we felt a lot of feelings about this because people had been so excited about it. We'd been so excited about it. But we were starting to say, are we kind of in over our head? Is this like less promising than we thought? And so we sat down and we did some desk research. We talked to some experts. And ultimately we said, we think that there's still a decent chance that this is a phenomenal opportunity. Mm-hmm. And we think that we just can't resolve these uncertainties until we actually run a program on the ground. So let's go run a program on the ground. And in a year, we'll circle back and we'll say, were we right about these uncertainties? And we thought that there was a decent chance that we would say, we were totally wrong, and this is actually phenomenal. And then some chance, maybe we'll look back and say, we're fools, we should have shut down back then. And some chance we'll be somewhere in the middle. And so we ended up saying, we have these concerns, but we're going to set them aside. We're really going to commit to running this program.
Disappointing results.
So overall, we've felt that those results from postnatal care were a disappointment because they showed that there were real challenges in implementation. There were real challenges despite us going to a lot of efforts to try and make sure that things happen. And then also the results on the effects were at the very least mixed.
How did this feel?
Not great. I remember it was around Thanksgiving, I think, and I was visiting my family, and I remember I was sitting and I was like parsing the results because it's not like just like a number pops up. It's like you have to do some amount of analysis, and I was seeing these numbers, and I was just scrolling through the surveys, and I'd be like, not using, and I just felt terrible.
I mean, like gut-wrenching. It must have just felt, really awful.
I think part of it is that when you run an organization, you feel very personally responsible for what's happening with that organization. And I think this felt extra strong for us because not only had we decided to found this organization, but we decided to found this organization as opposed to other organizations that could have been really, really good. And so like that was my co-founder and I kind of like staking our claim for like, we think that this is good. We think that this is so good that we want you to give money that you otherwise could give to these other really compelling organizations. Mm-hmm. And then not only that, but I'm good friends with a lot of other folks in the charity entrepreneurship community, which is great. They're an awesome group of people. But what that means is that sometimes I'll be chatting with someone and like in the nicest possible way, it's like their program's going phenomenally. They're helping so many people. They're getting this huge grant. And even though I think people make an effort to make it non-stressful and like non-competitive, it's such a warm community. It also just is inherently, you're sitting there and you're thinking, man, is it the intervention or is it me? And it's not the best feeling ever.
The ups and downs of founding an organization.
I think my overall experience with charity entrepreneurship, with founding an org, was that the benefits were a lot bigger than I'd expected. And then the downsides were a lot bigger than I expected. And I think I would go back and do it again. And I would recommend other people do it. But also, I did not comprehend how big of a change in my life it would be. And I don't want to say that this happens for everyone because I think people have very different experiences with it. But I think for me that sense of responsibility, that sense of like feeling like the results really reflected on me, which I don't fully endorse as a take and was something that I was trying to shift away from, but I found really tough because it was just true that for some aspects of the program, how well they went were like a direct reflection of how good of a job I did. And sometimes I would make a mistake and that would have bad effects in the world. And that was really stressful. And then some aspects of the program had very little to do with how hard I was working or how smart I was about making a particular choice. And I think that I found that to be immensely stressful. And I found it hard to turn off thinking about the organization. I would try to do these things like, hey, I won't check Slack after I stop work for the day and that kind of thing. But what I found is just I'd be walking around my life. And because this was like the most interesting and felt like the most important thing coming up in my life, that's what I would think about. So yeah, I did have this experience of I would wake up in the middle of the night to get a drink of water. And before I was even fully conscious, I would find that I was thinking about the organization or I was thinking about some of these issues, and then it would be hard to fall back asleep. And I've talked to other people who say, yeah, I have that exact same experience.
Wow. Yeah, I'm trying to think of an analogy and I'm finding it hard to, but it sounds closer to like, I don't know, having a child or something. Like you're like trying to like create this thing and there's so much responsibility and personal ownership in a way that you just don't have in most cases when you are employed by a place to do a thing. And like the bottom line responsibility isn't with you.
Right. And I think there's a lot of jobs where people have that sense of real responsibility. And I do think that there are good aspects of this. Like I found it deeply satisfying and deeply fulfilling. I remember when I was thinking about applying to jobs before this, I was thinking, I want to have this feeling that if I work extra, if I'm working extra hard, that'll make more good things happen in the world. I don't want to have this feeling of, oh, I'm accruing additional profit to a corporation, or, oh, it doesn't really matter that much how hard I work. But this is the flip side of that. This is the flip side where when it matters how good of a job you do, it's hard to let go of. And also, I do just think there is a big difference between being the person who's running the organization and then being someone who has a really substantial role, because ultimately so much of your job is making these really tough calls that you could potentially invest infinite time into. So it's really hard to know, when did I make a good decision? When did I invest the correct amount of time into making a decision? There's a lot that's really tough. And I think having a co-founder does make a big difference. There are some folks that solo found. I have so much respect for that. I could not have done that with MHI, but having a co-founder makes a big difference because you can really share that burden. And I also think having a community makes a big difference, where I would talk to other folks running orgs and say, oh my gosh, I found this thing immensely stressful and I don't know if I made the right call. And they would say, I felt the exact same way. And then also having advisors who we could turn to. And I think that helps take on some of that responsibility that's similar to having a manager. But I didn't totally trust that our advisors would be telling us in the frankest possible way if we were totally messing up. And so it was hard. I felt like I had to carry that burden myself. And so I ended up doing a lot of second guessing myself, a lot of asking myself, am I messing up? Am I doing a good job? And in retrospect, I wish I'd done more to try and offload that. But I think it's fundamentally just a super, super tough challenge.
Entrepreneurship and being willing to make risky bets.
Did you have the sense that some of the charity entrepreneurship charities shut down, and that there were like quote unquote failures to come out of the incubation program, and that was a possible outcome?
Yeah, so there have been organizations that have shut down, and then like since we shut down, another actually organization from our cohort also shut down. But before we had shut down, it was generally either because things had gone wrong quite early on, and there wasn't a clear-cut example of someone saying this just doesn't work as well as we'd hoped, and so we're going to shut down and just leave it as that. I do think the folks at Charity Entrepreneurship kind of wanted this to be more of a thing, because I think they do have this genuine bets-based mindset. And I don't want to put words in their mouth, but my sense of it is that the ideal is you start a bunch of charities, they test stuff out, and then some of them turn out to be phenomenally effective, and you want to, scale those up as fast as possible. Some of them turn out to not work out at all, and you want to shut those down as quickly as possible. And then there's a lot of disagreement about what you do in the middle cases. So some people would say, if it's not going to be the most effective thing, then you should shut it down. Some people would say, well, it depends on where you get your funding from. But I think like one of the reasons I took this so hard is because entrepreneurship is all about this bets-based mindset. So you say, hey, I'm going to take a bunch of bets. I'm going to take some risky bets that have really high upside. And this is like a winning strategy in life. But maybe it's not a winning strategy for like any given hand. And so like the fact of the matter is that like I believe that intellectually, but like I do not believe that emotionally. And I have now met a bunch of people who are really good at doing that emotionally. And I've realized I'm just not one of those people. Like, I think I'm more entrepreneurial than your average person. I don't think I'm the maximally entrepreneurial person. And I also think it's just human nature to not like failing. So, you know.
Yeah, it feels like it's one of these cases where the optimal thing might be to have, you know, a bunch of people make these bets and have some massively pay off and some not pay off and fail. And on the whole, that's a great strategy. And everyone participating should like get some credit for the wins, because they're like participating in the system that overall has this really valuable high payoff strategy. But individually, the people who like make the really successful charities with high cost effectiveness get to feel that win very viscerally. And the people who don't feel like they've lost, despite it being a thing that was like maybe the best thing for the world. And it just feels incredibly unfair and really, really difficult and painful. And yeah, I'm both like grateful to you for participating. I'm also like, yeah, like outraged, or not quite outraged, but I feel like indignant that there are cases where this strategy is optimal and people have to, I mean, I think it is really applicable for careers and the thing 80,000 hours is about. We're telling a bunch of people to be really ambitious with their careers. And it does make me feel really pained that for some, despite it being the optimal thing that they took a really big career bet, they will feel like they failed. But that's like still part of, I don't know, the like portfolio we want to have. So just a massive thank you.
I appreciate it.
And well done. But obviously it felt really painful.
Why aren't more charities shutting down?
It strikes me that charities seem to scale back or shut down at potentially like a much lower rate than like businesses. And that seems bad. It seems like businesses have some incentives that don't always lead to incredible outcomes, but they are probably tracking something like whether they provide value. And if charities aren't shutting down nearly as often, that might suggest something about too many existing that aren't providing much value. Does that seem true to you?
So I think you're pointing to the most important factor here, which is that structurally, charities are built in such a way that your expectation on priors would be that a lot of them would just be doing stuff that's not very useful. Because the difference is that the way a business works is, you know, at least in an ideal case, a business provides a product or a service to their consumers. If that product or service isn't very good, then unless there's monopoly or something wonky going on, consumers stop purchasing that product and, you know, that business goes out of business. But what happens is that instead of it being dual when it comes to charities, it's actually this triangle. So on one point you have the charity, on one point you have its beneficiaries, but then on another point you have the donor. And in some ways, the donor ends up having most of the power in some ways, because if the donor is the one that's giving the money to make this program happen, and you're the charity and you're looking there at your beneficiaries and you're looking there at your donor and you're saying, if the donor doesn't like what we're doing, the program can't happen. But if the beneficiaries don't like what's going on, as long as the donor keeps liking this can keep happening. And to be clear, I'm not saying that, you know, charity founders are sitting there saying, wah, ha, 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 I'm going to do bad things for my beneficiaries. I think, you know, nearly all charity founders are really well-intentioned and are trying to make the world better. But you end up in this structural space where you are structurally incentivized to make your donors as happy as possible. And then you're only really incentivized to make sure you're helping the beneficiaries insofar as the donor cares about it. And so maybe the donor, you know, wants to see photos of happy seeming beneficiaries. Maybe they want to see studies of this program is really effective. Maybe they want to see ongoing monitoring and evaluation data. But depending on what they demand, things could look very different on the ground. And of course, organizations can also demand these things. But in general, I think funders are often the ones who have the most leverage.
How to think about shutting down.
How realistic is it to think that nonprofits will shut down programs with 30 plus employees and that don't have that culture? Yeah, or even entirely shut down their organization.
So I absolutely agree with the premise that this is a tough challenge and one that is not going to be solved in a day. I think that reframing it from shutting down to shifting program focus areas or shifting people from one program to another program is a really helpful way of thinking about this. And I think one interesting example for this is new incentives, which provides conditional cash transfers to help incentivize immunizations. And you may have heard of new incentives because right now it's doing really well. It's one of GiveWell's top charities. It's widely recommended. But what you might not know is that when new incentives originally started, they were doing a very different program. So their founder was really excited about conditional cash transfers to help reduce poverty. And she was originally focused on, I think it was cash transfers to prevent mother-to-child HIV transmission. And so she was working in Nigeria, and they were working at a bunch of clinics, and it was going decently. But they realized, oh, actually, things look different than we'd originally thought, and we're really not going to be able to scale up with this program. And so, they'd been operating for a couple of years. It had been going kind of well. And I think they faced this fork in the road. I mean, I wasn't involved at all, but my sense is they faced this fork in the road of, should we keep going with this program that we think is decent, or should we try to pivot to something else? And I can imagine them, sitting in the room trying to figure out, wow, this is a really tough decision. We have a lot of staff who might be affected. What's going to happen? And what they ended up saying is, look, we are here to make a cost-effective, impactful charity, and we want to focus on the most useful thing. So they ended up pivoting. They pivoted to these cash transfers for immunization. They ran an RCT. It turned out really well. And then they massively scaled. So they went from a small number of employees to I think they now have more than 3,000 employees in Nigeria.
Wow. Holy crap, I did not know that.
And so pivoting is what allowed them to unlock their potential as an organization.
Nice.
And so I think that this is a lot about how we frame this conversation. Are we framing this as more people should do the painful and unpleasant thing of shutting down? Or do we frame this as more people should look at the exciting opportunities of pivoting their programs to things that can help more people?